So out of boredom,
There we
I
go.
read When God Spoke Greek.
Oh yeah,
I found that interesting.
that's an
Very
excellent book.
super interesting.
It's a very, I think that was a very interesting book. I read that. I used to read on my commutes on the bus when I lived in London, and that was one of my favorites that I read just as I was at the top of a double-decker bus roaming through town, learning about the Septuagint.
Well, for me, and I'm only speaking for Tad, you read that, and to me, you start to understand why there's confusion and inconsistencies. And I'm more comfortable with the confusion and inconsistencies than I am people who try and think it's absolute.
Yeah. And I think that's actually part of the point of the book, is that this idea of precise verbal accuracy is relatively new, and not the way that Bible reading was handled over centuries, and not the way it's meant to be handled now. And so yeah, he's that guy is he's a good writer. You can tell he's got a journalism background, because he's clear and interesting. I am going to recommend a book before we get started. That is, I think, a helpful book for, especially as we talk about the Hebrew Bible. And the author is Pete Enns. The last name is Enns. And the book is called The Bible Tells Me So. Pete Enns is worth reading all of his stuff. He's got another book called The Sin of Certainty, Tad, which kind of speaks to what you just said. But, and
why did you point that at me?
Well, because
there's other people you could point that out.
Yeah, I know, but I chose you.
Okay.
Because of what you said about, you liked the inconsistencies and the ambiguities more than the certainty, and I think you'd enjoy. Let me put it this way: some of the language you hear from me from the pulpit about trusting God, and what God has done in Christ is more important than precise doctrinal belief. And so I think that's the point that he is making, and that's also his historical understanding of the way faith has developed over a couple of thousand years, actually maybe closer to 4,000 years. And to me, that's an important distinction to make. You can have all the right doctrines, but if it's not demonstrated in a trust in that God is who God says he is and will do what God says God will do, then that's a breakdown. And so anyway, Pete Enns, The Bible Tells Me So. It is not a technical read at all. It's a pretty good book, and but I'm curious to know what people end up thinking about that. So I'm going to do just another minute of preamble before we start. I will eventually have a list of words and terms that you can look up for yourself and enjoy, a good Google search. I haven't done that yet. Turn my phone off. My phone is telling me time for the FPC SLO Bible study.
I think so.
John, what about Peter's
Peter Enns' book, he's got another book that's more comprehensive called Inspiration and Incarnation.
Yeah.
And he talks about the Bible.
Yes.
But I agree with you. I think that book, because you recommended it and I read it, I read 4 of his books now, but that book, The Bible Tells Me So, is the best book you could possibly imagine as a complementary thing to read with your course, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, I was hoping so. And I think that as we roam, we're going to continue through the Old Testament for a while. We're going to talk, get a little headway now on how it came about. But that'll be an interesting thing for us to look at. That's a good book on the side. The Bible Tells Me So by Pete Enns. E-N as in Nancy, N-N-S. See, it got your name in there, Nancy. I'm going to mute everybody and let us get started. And I will we'll hear your voices again in about 30, 40 minutes or so. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for bringing us together this way. We thank you for the privilege that it is to know your scriptures, but also to know about your scriptures. We ask that you'd be with us in this hour and make these details connected to our own reading for our own spiritual growth of the words that you've given us to study. We pray these things in your Son's name. Amen. So I won't put the quote up again from, let George in. I won't read the quote again from David Hubbard, but I will just remind you that David Allen Hubbard, a brilliant Old Testament scholar, started a chapter about the Bible in a book of his by talking about the way a parent speaks to a child, and especially the way a parent speaks to an infant, where it's the sound and the words and the touch that communicate love and protection and confidence and all those things. And he uses that as an analogy for how God speaks to us in the scriptures. And for the last 35 years, it has been my go-to image for how I think about the questions of inspiration and revelation. And so I'll keep just drawing us back to that. As we go through this study, we're exploring the history of the Bible, of the Bible itself. We'll get to a point where we're talking about some of the history in the Bible, but we're talking about the history of the Bible, how this book, how this collection of books that go back to the Bronze Age, how they have become the sacred text for our faith and the place where God reveals some of who God is in those pages. I said maybe in the first or second one of our sessions that the Bible in no way communicates everything there is to know about God. That would be a heresy. But it does communicate what God invites us to know about himself so that we can know him. And so I think that's an important thing. For us, especially for people who can't seem to find room for anything in life that doesn't appear in the Bible. I would say that is a limitation on the life that God gave us that isn't necessary. The Bible does not say everything that can be known about God. Words cannot contain everything that can be known about God. But the Bible does contain everything we need to know to enter into a relationship with God. And so it's important, I think, for us to have distinctions like that, to have words for that distinction that maybe we all knew instinctively, but maybe have never said in that way before. We're exploring the history of the Bible, and we're doing this to deepen our understanding of how the Bible came to us. But we're also doing it to deepen our understanding of how God speaks to us through these human stories. and the ways that these human stories have been told and retold and passed down from generation to generation across cultures, across massive shifts in worldview. Again, from the Bronze Age all the way up through the area, one of the first great eras of Western empires in the 1,000 years before Christ, right up into Alexander. And I will keep beating on how important Alexander's conquering of the world and imposing a common language is for our own faith story. But then through Rome and through the collapse of Rome and really the collapse of Western culture for as much as 800 years or so, or maybe more. And then through the Renaissance and Reformation and through other eras, the scientific revolution, these words continue to speak to us. And knowing how they came about, I think, is an important part of how we can understand our faith better. The basics are the same as they were the last 2 weeks. There are 66 books in the Bible, 39 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New. The Old Testament is primarily written in Hebrew, although we've already talked a little bit about a major exception to that. The New Testament is written in a form of Greek called Koine Greek, which just meant common Greek. It's different from the classical Greek of Aristotle and Plato and that era. It's a common, it's a Greek that has a fairly limited vocabulary, and it made governing a huge empire that much easier for Alexander and Alexander's followers. We've talked already that testament is another way of saying covenant. And so one way to describe the Bible is the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. You hear me on Communion Sunday say this blood is the new covenant, or this cup is the new covenant given in my blood. And so when we talk about the Old and New Testaments, we're talking about two different categories of covenant that God has entered into with his human creation. The New Testament has been in its present form since about the year 120. This is where I always have a note to say, forget everything that you read in the Da Vinci Code. There were some councils and things, and finally the canon is closed officially by a council in the year 397. But don't think that the church wandered around for 400 years without a Bible. For much of those 400 years or 300 years or so after the last book of the Bible was written, the collection was remarkably consistent. And so that's an important thing. And so tonight we're back in the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, the old set of covenants. And some of this requires that history that we've been talking about, that David was king and then his son became king, and then Solomon's sons fell into civil war, and the 12 tribes of Israel that David had unified split into 2 tribes in the south and 10 in the north. Those countries went along in their own separate way as practitioners of Judaism. And both understanding themselves to be God's people. We talked about in 722, I forget what year now, 7 something, the northern kingdom is carted off into exile, and its cities are largely destroyed. They never recover from exile. In 586 BC, a couple hundred years later, the southern kingdom is carted off into exile by Babylon, and they do recover. They get sent back after a couple of generations with money to rebuild Jerusalem and to rebuild the walls around the city. We're going to circle back to that because we need to talk about the temple today and its significance for faith. And then importantly, last week we talked about this, how the different ways that the Old Testament texts were written down in exile, got joined together in a unified document that became our Old Testament. And that one of the ways you can identify that is different ways in Genesis, for example, that God is talked about, or that worship and sacrifices are talked about. And so there was that acronym last week of JEDP. We'll circle back to that a couple times and up ahead. I don't want to get too deep into those weeds today, but what you ought to know, the practical part of understanding that, is that there are 3 names for God in the Old Testament. The first one is Elohim, E-L-O-H-I-M, Elohim. And that, when that gets translated into English in our Bibles, it's capital G, small o, small d. It's just God with a capital G. There's another word, Adonai, A-D-O-N-A-I, and that usually gets translated to Lord with a capital L and the rest small case. And so when you see somebody refer to God as Lord in with a capital L, but none of the rest of the letters capitalized, they're translating Adonai into English. And then you get to the granddaddy of names, the name that God gave to Moses from the burning bush, the name that we know now as Yahweh or Jehovah, depending on if you're coming at it from English or German. That is always translated in the Old Testament into English as Lord with all 4 letters capitalized. So that's a way you can look at your English translations and see through the English language into the original Hebrew, at least for the names of God. The one that ends up being the most common is Elohim, or some version of Elohim. And here's where you've seen it before. Almost any name that has EL in it, like Daniel, Lionel, Michael, maybe some of you can think of other ones, those are always rooted in some name that uses God in the name. So, so Lionel is actually an English word, an English name that's meant to connect to Lion of God. And there are other names that you can look up on, there's all kinds of websites that explain these. But when you see that EL, that's a Hebrew root for the name of God. And it usually means something of God is the way, is how that name originated. Michael, Daniel. I usually can think of like 8 or 9, and now I've only got those 3, but you get what I'm saying. For those of you who know World War II history, there is El Alamein, a major battle in North Africa. That original Semitic name was something of God. I don't know what Alamein means, but the El part is God. So that's just a trick for, as you read your Old Testaments, to see through the English back to the original language, at least on those 3 different names for God. So one of the other interesting things about the Old Testament in its development is that it was related to other things that were happening in the wider culture. And there are writings from the other parts of the culture that relate to parts of our own Old Testament. Some of you will know the name or have heard of something called the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Gilgamesh Epic. The Gilgamesh Epic was it is in some view the oldest existing piece of literature in all of world history. Parts of it date back to 2700 BC. That's almost 5,000 years ago. And it was written in Mesopotamia, which is For most of us who, when we took Western Civ in high school, you know that world civilization starts in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. I'm seeing a few nods. That's Mesopotamia. And it is in that area that this story was written. I was just listening in preparation for this to a podcast about this document over this week. And one of the things that all three scholars in this podcast were agreeing on is that, at least in its original form, it was written by one person, that there's a unity of style in the Gilgamesh epic that would lead you to believe that one person wrote it, at least in its original form. That's interesting in itself. There are thousands of fragments of the Gilgamesh epic. I read that there were 15,000 fragments of the Gilgamesh epic, most of them discovered during the heyday of ancient civilization archaeology in the 19th century, in the 1800s. So a lot of these things ended up in the grand museums of Europe and in Jerusalem to be studied there. There are two stories from the Gilgamesh epic. I'm just gonna summarize these a little bit because we got a long way to go. But in tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic, a survivor tells a story of a great flood. And it's very interesting to me how some of this parallels the flood story that we see in the first few chapters of Genesis. In the Gilgamesh epic, it appears that humans made too much noise and they were disturbing the sleep of the gods. And so the gods sent a flood. And the gods together huddle together and they decide they're going to keep the flood secret from humans, so it would surprise them. But Ea, the god of wisdom, the Mesopotamian god of wisdom, got around the rule by telling the story to the wall of a house. And the wall spoke it to a person. And that person is the Noah character in the Gilgamesh flood. And here's what the god of wisdom then tells a character named Utnapishtim. I'm only going to say it once because I won't say it the same way twice. Tells him to build a boat to escape the flood. And here's the quote from the Gilgamesh epic: "Demolish your house, build a boat, abandon your riches and seek survival, spurn property and save your life." And so I am going to say it again. Utnapishtim does build a boat, does survive the flood, and ultimately he's the character that tells the story to Gilgamesh, who is a king. So when archaeologists found these fragments of the story and put them together, they realized that there's a separate account of a flood that happened in the ancient times. Now, for some people, that was confirmation that their trust in the biblical accounts of ancient history or pre-ancient history had some accuracy to them. And I don't think that's a bad conclusion to come to. Clearly, something really bad happened with water in the Bronze Age in what was the earliest area of Western civilization. So there's a second story, and it relates to a passage from the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, which we're going to talk about in a few weeks, the book of Ecclesiastes. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, most scholars agree that they had some contact with the biblical story of Ecclesiastes. And the clearest connection is in this advice given to the king and the advice that we hear from Qoheleth, which, if you've read Ecclesiastes, Qoheleth is Hebrew for preacher. And it's the name of the person who's telling the story, sharing the wisdom in our book of Ecclesiastes. But listen to what it says in the Gilgamesh epic. You, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, keep enjoying yourself day and night, every day make merry, dance and play day and night. Let your clothes be clean and let your head be washed. May you be bathed in water. Gaze on the little one who holds your hand. Let a wife enjoy your repeated embrace. Such is the destiny of mortal men. Now, we might think, wow, that's first off, it's a little racy. And it doesn't seem to be the same kind of rules-bound faith that we think of in the Old Testament. But listen to what it says. This is from the 9th chapter of Ecclesiastes. Go, eat your bread with enjoyment. Drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has long ago approved of what you do. Let your garments always be white. Do not let the oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love. All the days of your life have been given to you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. That under the sun thing that's a refrain that repeats a lot in Ecclesiastes. But do you hear the parallels? The deity saying to a human, look, life's hard. Enjoy the things and the people that you have. Love your spouse, enjoy your children, eat good food and drink good wine. Wear clean clothes. Notice that's in both of them. Wear clean clothes. And so when archaeologists discovered that part and translated it, and the biblical scholars noticed that, well, that sounds just like Ecclesiastes, then you realize there was probably a lot of cross-communication among ancient cultures, even before the first words of our Old Testament were written. Now, those connections show us that the earliest Hebrew people were connected to the culture around them, and they understood God in relation to the ways that other relationships with God were communicated at the time. But what makes the Hebrew faith, what we would call the Jewish faith, back then the Hebrew faith, what makes it unique in its time is that it was the first religion to propose the idea that there was one God and one God only. The technical term is monotheism. That's a long word that we can all figure out. Mono means one, theism means the study of God. One God. That was new to the ancient world. The idea that one God, I mean, most humans had the same reaction that some of us have had. How can one God hear all of our prayers, act on them in a way that is individual or to our community? How can one God accomplish all of that? Most of the ancients thought that that wasn't possible, so they had all kinds of gods. You know, Greek mythology and then Roman mythology and other Eastern and Middle Eastern religions, they all have multiple gods. The Hebrews, who are our spiritual ancestors, changed that. The Hebrews were mocked by the surrounding nations for only having one God. But that ended up being what made the early Semitic people who became the Hebrews, that's what differentiated them from the other cultures around them. So sometimes you'll be reading the Old Testament and God will be saying, as you know, I'm the one true God. That speaks into that relationship with other countries and other cultures where they had multiple gods. So they unified God. They also unified themselves. And I mentioned it before, but the Hebrews were unified, took all 12 tribes and were unified into one nation under King David. And then his son, Solomon, and I explained how it split to the kingdom, but before that, Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem. And if you've read some of those early stories of the stories of God's people, in between the exodus from Egypt and the formation of Israel, you know that the temple, the kings wanted to build a temple. David only got to build a big tent. But Solomon, it was his job as the second generation unifier of all 12 tribes of Israel. Solomon is the one who builds the temple on Mount Moriah, which is now the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. I'm going to show some pictures in just a minute. What was the temple for? The temple was for two things. It was to house the Ark of the Covenant, which all of you have seen thanks to Steven Spielberg. And it was also meant to be the place where God dwelt on earth and could be worshiped in person. Now, there are all kinds of different rules for how that happened in the Old Testament, as opposed to we see Jesus coming as human and dining with people and interacting with people, even touching people. There were all kinds of rules about the temple. It was called the Holy of Holies inside the room. And I'm going to show a picture here. This is a representation of what the first Temple of Solomon looked like. So there's a fire here, and the fire might have been where sacrifices were offered. Inside, behind this curtain, only a priest who had engaged in all of the ritual cleansing to make sure that they were pure, only the priests could enter in here. And they would enter in and offer prayers, interact with God on behalf of all of God's people. And so this temple, this first temple, was destroyed by the Babylonians when they took the southern kingdom into exile in 586, 587 BC. So that temple that one is interesting, but then we get to, and here, I'm just going to show you a representation of what the Ark of the Covenant might have looked like. There's a whole series of pages in the Old Testament that describe what it was supposed to look like, with these figures on top and these rings and these long rods that were meant to prevent any human from touching this container. And it's called an ark, but what it really is a chest. And originally, the Ark of the Covenant held the tablets that had where God had written the 10 Commandments. And yes, there are some stories where the Hebrews carry this into battle with them. That's probably as close as it gets to Raiders of the Lost Ark. But this is what the Ark of the Covenant was meant to look like. And it was meant to be housed inside that structure I already showed you. And so that was destroyed in 586. And when they were allowed to come back, they built another temple on the same spot. And this is important because as you read through some of the things about Jewish history, you're going to see this referred to. Jewish history is divided up into First Temple Judaism and Second Temple Judaism. And that's important not just for Jews, but for Christians too, because Second Temple Judaism is the Judaism that was in place when Christ came. And so here's the Second Temple. This is what it looked like. Let's see if I can make that bigger. So there's a mountain that is on the edge of Old Jerusalem, was leveled at the top for the original temple. Then when they got to come back, they built it out a little better, rebuilt the walls, and rebuilt the temple. Now, for some of you, you will remember the wall of hostility in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, where it says, that Christ has come and broken down the wall of hostility. That was a nickname for this wall right here. Because no one who was no non-Jew could cross into this area over here. And there was an inscription there, which I have somewhere, and I'll show it to you one of these days, that there's an inscription that survives from this wall that says, anyone who crosses over this barrier has only themselves to blame for their death, which will immediately ensue. That's a wall of hostility. But this is the Second Temple. Now, the Second Temple was begun in the 500s BC, and it lasted through into the time of Jesus. But when King Herod took over, King Herod wanted to make a bigger temple, partly to God and partly to himself. But he also expanded the square footage of that Temple Mount. For those of you who've been to this part of the world, you've seen this. Here's another rendering of the Second Temple. This is the temple that would have been there when Christ was in Jerusalem. And so these areas back here under the pillars, there would have been market traders here. There would have been business being conducted out here, sometimes selling animals that could be offered as sacrifices. It's in this area, in the temple courts, where Jesus overturned the tables in the familiar story. So I want to show you what it looks like now, because that helps us get a feel for just how big it is. So this is all this condensed housing out. This is Jerusalem. This is old Jerusalem out here. But this area is the Temple Mount. There is no existing sure place where the original temples existed. The only thing you can say is that they were up on this area. But if you are you seeing the cursor as I move it? Okay, so the original Temple Mount would have gone from here and across here and then over here, kind of the area where the trees are. Herod built it out and expanded it to include this other area. This is a Herod that's a couple of generations before the Herod when Jesus was born. So you'll notice this mosque in the middle. This is an area that has been contested and taken and retaken and by Jews, by Christians, by Muslims over the last 2,000 years. First by Romans. The Second Temple was destroyed by Rome in 70 AD, just after the time of Christ. And so, but this is what it looks like now. It's hard to see, but this is an upraised plateau that overlooks the rest of the city. And it is really quite striking. You can wait in line. They take a limited number of visitors every day up into here. And it's a beautiful, meaningful place to walk around. Anyway, that's the show and tell for tonight. The first and second temple designations are important for us understanding the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I have a little video, but I don't know how to show it, so I may just link to it on the website that talks about how the Temple Mount was built. So that's the physical place of the temple that became the focus of Jewish worship from the time of David all the way until the current day, the present day. Wasn't always there were not always Jews in control of it. actually now, because it's in Jerusalem, which is as you know, is a contested city. The Orthodox Jews don't allow any Jews to go up to the temple, where the temple was, because it's all holy ground. But tourists can walk up there, but you do have to be covered. Men can't go in shorts. I had to buy a cloth to wrap around my legs when I was there. Women do cover their heads. And so I know that's in the news today, but it is a beautiful, striking place where three faiths kind of interact in that place, certainly in Jerusalem and even a little on the Temple Mount. So that's one of the, I think that's a background account for how some of the, about the history of Judaism. How does all of the Hebrew scripture, though, come through this contested area to us? And we could spend a whole month answering that. But the main thing you want to be aware of and look up for yourself is something called the Masoretic text. That's Masoretic. So we're going to fast forward a little bit, buckle up for a bit, to show how the Hebrew Bible text has been gathered and compiled and set. The standard Hebrew version of the Old Testament is called the Masoretic text, and it was completed between the 7th and 10th centuries AD. So we're a long way forward now. I'm going to do this because it helps us understand a little bit of the Old Testament. The texts had been around for 1,000 years, but this group of scholars over 300 years set the text and the pronunciation of the Hebrew words that are in the Hebrew Bible. Now, that was important because ancient Hebrew did not have vowels. I want you to think about that for a second. This language that is crucial to our understanding of God's ongoing relationship and love with human creation doesn't have any vowels. That was fine when the stories were written on scrolls and passed down orally from generation to generation, because people knew how to say the words. But between exiles and migrations and wars and changes of culture from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to Arabic in that area, the pronunciations of the Hebrew words in the Hebrew scriptures were lost. And so here's what that means. Let's say you came across two consonants, C and T, and it was up to you to decide what the word was that it represented. It could be cat, but it could also be cot, like a small bed, or it could be a cut, like a wound. The Masoretes, is what they were called, the Masoretes, who were scribes and Jewish scholars, they had to go through on every Hebrew word in the Hebrew scriptures and assign vowels to the words based on what they thought the pronunciation should be. Think about if you came across an TRCK. TRCK. That could be track, it could be trick, or it could be truck. Now, depending on the rest of the paragraph you're translating, those three words make it mean something completely different in each instance. And so the Masoretes, like I said, Jewish scribes and scholars, they made the final decisions on every word in the Hebrew Bible. And they set them down in texts with notes in the margins. The Masoretic text is full of notes in the margins. And if you've ever seen Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, you know that it has these little dots all over. The dots are the vowels. When Luann and I took Hebrew 30 some odd years ago, when I took the final, I came in with the dots memorized in my head and wrote them on my desk. That wasn't cheating because I didn't bring something in. They were in my head. I just didn't think they could stay in my head for the 3 hours of the exam. So I used my short-term memory and wrote the dots down. And that's how I survived my Hebrew final in seminary. I think what we want to remember is that the Masoretes completed this task 500 years before there was a printing press. Meaning that this work, which took the better part of 300 years before it was completed, then had to be copied by hand with all of those notes and all of those dots and every word in the Old Testament in Hebrew so that it could be distributed to other Jewish communities around the world. Long ago, the Christian church, all wings of it, decided that the Masoretic text was always going to be the text that we used to translate our Old Testament. So we have this group of scholars, sometimes multi-generations in the same families, who worked on this project over 300 years. We have them to thank for creating a Hebrew that can be pronounced and spoken and read with great fruit, both by Jews and by Christians. So that's our sweeping saga of a tale for this evening. And I'm going to unmute you, and we can talk about any part of that you like. Let me unmute everyone and see what you guys have to say.
So these Masoretic guys were still Hebrew, but they were Hebrew with vowels. Is that, I mean,
Yes.
yeah, we're kind of advanced Hebrew. Or
It was advanced Hebrew or simple Hebrew, you know,
simplified
hardcore Hebrew.
They realized that this was going to be tough for anybody else in the future. So they put in the dots.
It is an amazing act of scholarly service to benefit a religious faith, an entire faith. So they did it for the Jewish community. Christians have used the Masoretic text as the source material for our translations of the Old Testament. Tad, did you have a question?
Well, yeah. So about the time of Jesus, if I understand right, Hebrew was really not spoken that much. Weren't they speaking Aramaic?
They were, no, not Arabic, Aramaic.
Aramaic.
Yeah, Aramaic.
And I can't say it.
That's all right. They were actually speaking Greek in the marketplace. One of the regional languages, and the regional language that Jesus spoke was Aramaic. I think last week we found that it was the northern part of Israel, what had been Israel, into Syria, that it was a Syrian dialect of a Semitic language. And Jesus, of course, spent a lot of his time up in the northern part of the country, in Galilee. And so the Old Testament that Jesus read socially would have been in Greek. The Old Testament he read in the synagogue would have been in Hebrew. And any commercial conversation that he had with people from another country would have been in Greek. And any personal conversation he had with his inner circle would have been probably in Aramaic.
Yeah.
So my point is that the oral tradition is, I mean, for a language that doesn't have vowels, this complicates the oral tradition, doesn't it?
Well, no, but they knew how it was meant to be said because they heard it from their parents. And they heard it from their parents. So it's the disruption in the oral tradition that made Jews all over the world forget how to pronounce the words because they weren't hearing them anymore. Then they had the scrolls, but they couldn't pronounce them.
Mhm.
And so, one other example for us is Yahweh.
10 or 2.
Yahweh is YH, YHWH. And so you get the Germans get a hold of it and it becomes Jehovah. And you have Anglo-Saxon scholars and it becomes Yahweh. But it's the same consonants, just attached with slightly different vowels. So even in English, we've had that issue.
Well, I was just going to say, John, that so you have the Septuagint that was written collectively from about the 3rd century, I guess, BC, clear to the 2nd century AD. But some of the translation was a little different from the Hebrew, and the most striking one was in Isaiah 7:14. Maybe I'm stealing your thunder, because the word for that is translated in the Septuagint and also in Matthew's Gospel is virgin. Virgin shall conceive.
Yeah.
But in Isaiah 7:14, the word is Alma, which means a young woman.
Yeah.
If it would have been virgin, I think was the word would be Bethulah. So you have these arguments going on between the Hebrew text and the Septuagint.
We will come back to that one when we get to the RSV, which is miles down the road for us. But yes, that's exactly right. Some of this is just to give you a sense, a 3-dimensional sense of how parts of our Bible came to us, how it was spoken and then written and then lost and then restored and then translated, and then somehow you can get it at Barnes and Noble. I think that's a rich part of the story. Steve, please.
So when you were talking about the 3 names in the Old Testament in English,
Yes.
for Adonai, it's Lord in English.
Yeah.
And in the southern kingdom, it was Elohim, and it's God in English. And then when it's Lord in all caps, it's what in Hebrew?
It's Yahweh.
Yahweh.
Yeah.
And last week, I think we spelled it YAHWEH.
Right.
But the Germans use that. You see it sometimes as a word that couldn't be spoken, right?
Right. And so for those of you who have Jews in your community, in your circles of friends, or remember when you were in college and the Jewish fellowship groups were going to meet and talk about God, they always said G-D, because they were not allowed to say or print the name of God. Oddly enough, that's one of the ways the Jews forgot how to pronounce the name of God. It was so holy that they didn't say it. But after a generation or two, the last person who knew how to say it wasn't there anymore. And so even the people of God couldn't pronounce the name of God. Yeah, please, Susan.
You talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh,
Gilgamesh, yeah.
which was a parallel, I'll say, secular text. Is that correct? And
Yeah.
but how over how many years was that written?
Well, I think the people who know better than I do believe that it was written in its original form by one person in about 2700 BC. And then it became a national epic. Remember and so it got written and rewritten and added to, and it was carved into clay cylinders, which is the way you wrote back then, called cuneiforms. And I'm sorry, I didn't think to get a picture of those because they're really cool to look at. But cuneiforms, they're round, and you just read the story around in this language, and it's in this ancient form of now I'm going to get in trouble. One of the original languages of what we would call Babylon, and I think it's Akkadian, Akkadin. And so, but yeah, so that's how far back it goes. But it did evolve over time. Like Beowulf, Beowulf's written in somewhere around the year 900 as an Anglo-Saxon poem, but it's been added to and tinkered with over time.
And John, to compare the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written 2750 BC, to the first chapters of Genesis, well, the first chapters of Genesis were probably written around the 6th and the 7th centuries BC. So it's a lot different.
It's a lot different, yeah. But I want to make sure that when you say that, yes, written down maybe for the first time in 700 BC, but existing as part of a long-standing oral tradition for 500 years,
Oh, yeah.
1200 years before that. So help me out on this. Is this, and I'm not looking for, because I'm quite happy to shift gears as we move ahead, but is this historical stuff interesting?
Yeah, good.
What I want you to do, what I want you to do eventually is go to Ecclesiastes and read some of those stretches and just let your mind wonder what other cultures were hearing similar wisdom from their own sacred texts. And to get a feel for the Judaism that we see in the Old Testament, that might be different from just a straight line from Adam and Eve to Jesus. Because there are no straight lines in the Old Testament. Every time you think you've got a straight line, certainly David thought, oh, I've unified all the 12 tribes now, we're going to be one nation forever. That doesn't last more than 2 generations. His grandchildren ruined it. That's how close it was to his time. So there are no straight, uninteresting lines in the Old Testament. Almost all of these stories have these deep roots in cultural stories that people read and experienced. I think I said last week, the oldest book in the Old Testament is Job. A story about God and the devil making a bet on the righteousness of one of God's people. Now, you don't want to read that as history, and I'm getting ahead of myself because we're going to talk about the different kinds of literatures, but it was meant in the ancient times to be an account for human suffering, to talk about human suffering in a way that allowed you to still believe in the goodness of God. And Ruth is an old story. The book of Esther, which doesn't mention God. There's no mention of God in Esther, and yet it is a part of the literature of the Jewish faith, going back to pre-written Judaism. And so there are all kinds of things like that I think make up an interesting part of this story. But my goal is not to have you all become English or history majors. I think that ship has sailed. But it's to get you into a place where when you read the Bible for yourself, it's richer and deeper than it was before. That's our goal over these next few months that we'll be journeying through this. And we're going to get out of Mesopotamia and the Bronze Age really quickly. I think we've hammered through this now enough, and we'll move into the maybe some of the transitional times into the New Testament times. But if you're going to look up something on Google, and I checked them out today, the Wikipedia articles are pretty solid on the First Temple and the Second Temple. You don't have to read the whole thing, but to read the summaries at the top, I think explain a little bit of why those are such important eras within Judaism. There are people, Orthodox Jews are praying and longing for a third temple. And they're praying and longing for a third temple alongside American fundamentalists who believe that a third temple is a necessary step for the end times. So just imagine who's in league here. Who, you know, they say politics makes strange bedfellows. It's got nothing on religion. You have the most orthodox wing of the Jewish faith and the most conservative wing of the Protestant Christian faith, who think that only people who make their kind of commitment to Christ are included in God's family. You have them in partnership to try and accomplish something that does something very different for both faiths. For the Orthodox Jews, it's to bring the Messiah finally. And for the fundamentalist Christians, it's to blow the whole thing up and have God come and divide the sheep from the goats and get on with the lake of fire business. So we have miles to go before we get there, but just so you know, that's part of the story. And that's part of the ongoing story. When you hear a news story that comes from Jerusalem about a group of ultra-Orthodox doing something, they're doing something to try and establish ancient Judaism again in Jerusalem. Steve, please.
Well, I guess it is muddying the waters. When does Islam make its claim on the Temple Mount?
The rise of Islam is I think, starting in around 600 or so, and grows rapidly in that region. And then, you know, just like, you know, just in the last century in Europe, Western Europeans have done the same thing. You know, at some point, one country controls this area and then they get pushed back and another country control. Poor Poland has been a part of Germany and Russia at various times over the last 100 years. It had only had self-governance for 16 years, I think, before Germany invaded Poland in 1939. So Jerusalem is like that, and the Middle East is like that. So Islam comes through and conquers that whole territory. That leads to the Crusades, European adventurers coming down trying to drive Islam out of the holy places. That leads to some of the most awful stains in the history of the Christian church. Ironically, during the stable years of Islamic rule, Christians and Jews were allowed to function in Islamic controlled countries, and some of the great Jewish literature was written under Islamic rule.
But there's not a religious claim such as Allah goes to heaven from.
I think it's more, you know,
more of a political.
No, you're catching me in a gap, but I'm happy to look that up because Islam does have a claim on that. And I believe that may be where Muhammad ascended into heaven.
But yeah, I was wondering if, I mean, that's where, I mean, Mecca and other areas are more central, I think, than
Yeah, but they're all those cities, Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem, are tied to different parts of Muhammad's life. And so the reason those are the pilgrimage sites are for different reasons related to different parts of Muhammad's life. But I have to look up, I don't want to say, obviously I know more about Christianity and Judaism than I do about Islam, but I know that there were long stretches of stability under Islamic rule where to a certain extent, Judaism and to a lesser extent, Christianity thrived. But I don't know if we don't always remember how close Islam came to taking Western Europe.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a lot of Islamic architecture and remnants in Spain because they came up that way over from Gibraltar. But also, I think the final battle that beat back the Ottoman Empire was fought outside of Budapest. That's way up in Western Europe. I mean, Hungary was a quick flight from where I used to live. And Budapest was a typical vacation place for folks from London. It's like an hour and a half flight, maybe a 2-hour flight. So you're talking about Islam coming up from two directions, threatening to take what would be now Hungary, Germany, Poland, France, and ultimately, and then to connect with their people in Spain coming up the other way. And so it spreads for a long ways before it ends up receding back, and the Ottoman Empire ends up being, where what we would call Yugoslavia and all the way down into the Middle East. And but that's stable for centuries. The Ottoman Empire isn't gone until World War I. So anyway, we're roaming through history now, but any other final questions or Tad, please, and then Brooke.
Well, Brooke, go first.
Okay, Brooke.
When you're showing the image of where the Temple Mount today, you were saying that Orthodox Jews don't go within the walls, and so where does that leave the Wailing Wall?
The Wailing Wall, that's a great question, Brooke. The Wailing Wall is one of the outside walls of the Temple Mount. So the Temple Mount is built up. It's this big plateau built up, and one of the outside walls of it is the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. Those are the same thing.
How did that get designated?
It's where Orthodox Jews go to pray for everyone else to be wiped out and for God's holy kingdom to be restored in Jerusalem. That's probably an overstatement, but they don't want them there, let's say. But it's for God to come and reestablish his rule on earth. And that's what they're praying. And the wailing is for the continuing loss of Jerusalem as the central place only of the Jewish faith. And you can walk right up there. Now they're in sections. Men can walk to one section and women can walk to another. But both can walk to see the outer surface of the Western Wall, which is the wall that Herod built to hold up the Temple Mount. Yeah, Luann.
Well, I just wanted to say that anybody can pray at the Wailing Wall. That many years ago when I was there, you write something on the paper and you place. So yeah.
I did say anybody can go there, but they have there is a divider.
Oh, right.
You can't go to where the men are.
No.
And you can't go to where the women are.
No, I know that too, John.
And they will give you a covering for your head. So I have a yarmulke that I got from somebody there because I could not approach the wall with my head uncovered.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, it's a long time since I've been there. I mean, decades, but I didn't notice anybody. Well, where we were was not divided or anything.
Okay. Yeah.
But
No, there's a fence.
There must be a special place in the wall where any crazy person like I could go.
All the Gentiles.
Yeah. It's at least there's no dividing wall of hostility where you get killed and it's your own dumb fault. Tad, did you have a closing comment for us?
I don't know that it's closing, but I read an English translation of the Quran. And it
Uh-huh.
was very interesting. Number one, separating politics from religion. It was totally non-threatening.
Yeah.
And it almost seems like it assumed that you had read the Old and New Testament.
Sure.
I mean, there are lots and lots of references to
Right.
the children of Israel and Jesus, you know, so it was
Yeah.
really interesting, very
Yeah.
repetitive.
And you know, we talk about the three Abrahamic faiths, the three faiths that go back to God
Mhm.
calling Abraham to leave his country and pick up his family and move to another place. And that origin story is the origin story for Judaism, for Islam, and for Christianity,
Mhm.
or part of the origin story. Well, I've kept you 9 minutes after time.
So,
But we'll continue to move on through this. I think I think we've got enough of the background now to move into a different section. I think some of us will have a little bit more connection with how the New Testament books come together, and we'll start getting into that pretty soon. Let me close us in prayer. God, we thank you as your children that you reach toward us and speak to us in a way that we can begin to understand. And we thank you for the words that we find in the pages of our Bibles, for the ways that they reflect your heart and mind, and the ways that they are meant to change our hearts and our minds. We ask, as we continue on this journey together, that you would give us a deeper sense of what you want us to know about you, and what you want us to do about that as we read your Bible. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, everybody. See you Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks.